Okay, guys, so I'm going to try to go through this a little bit different. Uh, this is for the class of 21, 22 A pushers. As mentioned in the last email, I'm struggling a little bit to talk for very long times. So rather than try to do this 17 times today and tomorrow, I'm going to do a video and I hopefully can use it to supplement a little bit of our conversations. Got some water close by here, so I may have to stop and take a drink or two as I go through it. What I want to do is kind of repackage this a little bit differently so that it will be a little more in line, I think, with your notes. It may be a little bit of rehash for some of you guys. I know there were some of you I missed last week. So anyway, let's get started here, guys. What I've done is I've given this a title, The Impact of the Civil War, and basically also coming back to that question on the board of who won it. But what I want to look at is basically the impact of the Civil War, both politically, economically, and socially. But to get a run into this, rather than having contextualization, because we've already had that kind of built into, I'm going to look at how the military came to impact, particularly in the areas of political events. This first one probably should be not too new to you. What I'm talking about is the Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam basically was Abraham Lincoln's opportunity to issue his Emancipation Proclamation. He had been waiting to have a battlefield victory, essentially, and even though Antietam was a technical win, he felt like that was the time. And so, in issuing it on September the 22nd of 1862, had made clear, hopefully, guys, that they gave the South a little bit of time. If there's any southern states that wanted to come back for January the 1st of 1863, they'd be allowed to keep their slaves. It did not particularly impact the border states. The border states would be able to retain their slaves because they had to remain loyal through the government to the United States government. Lincoln, of course, also had an eye on the border states in the sense he didn't issue it before the military victory, but also he worried that if he issued it too soon, that the border states may possibly bolt. I'll come back to them a little bit later on. Now, this next one is probably going to be new, and that is going to be a battlefield victory that's going to have a political impact upon Abraham Lincoln himself. In 1864, prior to November of Thanksgiving of '64, Lincoln's election was looking pretty dim. General Sherman had begun his march to the sea through Georgia, and well before Thanksgiving timetable, he was able to take Atlanta and wire back about 2 weeks before the final vote in the president's election of 1864 that Atlanta now belonged in Union hands. This is going to be enough to push Lincoln over the top. That, and of course, in 1864, Lincoln elected to insist that the men be allowed to vote for. And in this case, even though they could vote for their old general, George B. McClellan, it's been a long time ago. And so ultimately, Lincoln was received nearly 80% of the men's votes. Many of those ballots have been written in blood because that's what's going to happen for the rest of this outcome. McClellan is a peace Democrat. You've elected him in 1864. There have been some type of resolution to the end of the war, but it probably would have led to permanent slavery or perhaps a divided country. Abraham Lincoln was a vote for the continuation and the finalization of that war. But finally, the next and most pivotal one would be to Ulysses S. Grant. As I think through the sketch outline I kind of drew out, I'm going to go to another point of military emphasis, and that is essentially talking about military turning points. And I'm going to bring that last one in on Grant for political impact. Here we go. Turning point battles of the Civil War started first with Gettysburg. Now, what made Gettysburg particularly interesting, some of you guys have already seen and heard a little bit about this. Robert E. Lee, for the second time, is going to be trying to invade into the North. Invade's probably not the right term. It was more or less a kind of a fear and awe type invasion. And in this time, he's going to penetrate all the way into Pennsylvania near Gettysburg. His intent would have been possibly also to acquire maybe some military resources. It was believed to have approximately 10,000 shoes there. Excuse me a minute. The long and short of it, this 3-day struggle involved one of the largest armies Lee will ever command, nearly 90,000 troops. And he will face General George Gordon Meade's troops of about 110,000. When the smoke cleared on January the 4th, Lee will retreat. What makes Gettysburg so significant is, first off, number one, it's the first time General Lee has ever really lost a major battle. Prior to this time, he has basically been win after win after win. As I mentioned last week before I came home, excuse me, guys, was Robert E. Lee was kind of like the Bill Belichick. He basically could win virtually almost everything at all odds. Number two, what's going to make Gettysburg most critical is when Lee surrenders, he will spend the rest of the war fighting in Virginia on defense, and it will have an enormous impact on the infrastructure for what the South will look like after the war. Ironically, though, when he retreats on July the 4th, 1,000 miles away to the south, unbeknownst to him, was another battle being wrapped up. It was really more of a 67-day siege in which Ulysses S. Grant had been hammering the Vicksburg, Mississippi. It was the last stronghold that controlled that portion of the Mississippi River. After 67 days, Grant had actually at one point used his engineers to alter the current of the Mississippi River just so he could get a better stranglehold on his enemy. To say the end came rapidly, July the 4th, 1863, Vicksburg surrenders. Why was that an impactful turning point? Number one, Grant was able to wire Abraham Lincoln and say that the old Mississippi now runs in the hands of the Union Army, effectively completing 1/3 of the Anaconda Plan and now splitting the Confederacy in half. Number two, Abraham Lincoln had had his watchful eye on Grant for about the last year of the war, and at this point he is convinced that Ulysses S. Grant is going to be his general. Let's just roll straight into the third point of how the military will have an impact upon political developments of the Civil War. Grant, when he takes over, had a rather stiff learning curve. The first 8 months of his time as the general against Robert E. Lee, he incurs nearly 40% of losses and casualties to his army. In that 8-month time, he basically recoups every one of his troops and actually has more towards the end of the war. As we talked about at the beginning of the contextualization with this video, or this lecture, was the fact that towards the end of the war of 1864 and 65, for every man lost on the battlefield, the Union Army was replacing them with 2 additional. Now, what does Grant bring to the war that makes it a military impact upon a political reality? He brought about what we could call total war. Grant, unlike other generals, when he fought some of these battles and lost, did not retreat, but rather kept pounding away, trying to penetrate deeper into Virginia, till ultimately, when the last siege gave way at Petersburg, Virginia, he was able to march his army into Richmond, Virginia on April the 2nd, 1865, basically 1 week to the end. Unfortunately, I don't have a board here to be able to show you what essentially happens. But what Grant has engineered is a process where he's brought Sherman up out of Atlanta and through the Carolinas, coming northerly towards Virginia. In the west, he has another general by the name of Philip Sheridan, who's bringing another army eastward into Virginia. And of course, he has his army of about 120,000 squared off against Robert E. Lee. And the long and short of it, guys, it's about an army anywhere between 250,000 men within 5 to 1 week's time that would have surrounded Robert E. Lee, who at this point had about 22,000 troops. Total war also meant allowing for Sherman to essentially rip through Georgia as he did, to come up through the Carolinas as he does. The political impact, though, beyond the political realm, we also have to go to the economic. I probably feel like I'm going to be doing at least one more video. So let me try to see if I can get economics for you. What was the economic impact on the Civil War? Well, first off, number one, let's look at the North. The North, as the aggressor, had to finance the vast majority of it. They borrowed nearly $3 billion in which to execute this war. What impact does that have on the American economy, or I should say the Northern economy? By the end of the war, prices had risen by nearly 80% in most Union markets, along with the fact that the North also has to incur additional cost in man being brought in. It's hard to undervalue the value of the African American soldier that will join after the Emancipation Proclamation. nearly 200,000 personnel will fight, 180,000 in the Army and around 20,000 in the Navy. What particularly striking to me is the Army itself was made up of 60% former ex-slaves that signed up and joined directly in the Army, going back into the South as Union soldiers, knowing that if they'd been captured, not only would they probably been killed, but they would also have been sold into slavery if they hadn't been killed. Otherwise, I guess you wouldn't sell them into slavery. Sorry about that. Now, bottom line is 25 additional came from the border states. And the long and short of that 180,000 men, there were only maybe 25 or 30,000 that were quite free blacks to begin with. So the political ramifications of that for that particular topic is pretty amazing. Let me just tell you one thing. Frederick Douglass was a primary pusher of that. He's one that went to Lincoln and said, let us have guns. Let us earn our freedom. Let us show the men that we can be. Moving to the economic side, though, let me punch up one more thing, and that would be the aftermath of that. For the American South, they were devastated. Not only have they lost over 4 million slaves for their main labor source, but to look a little bit at what the South was going to look like in the future. King Cotton, it wasn't dead, but it would take 20 years for it to get back to pre-Civil War levels of money being made. That's 1860 to roughly 1880. So true also for tobacco, 1860 to 1880. And the sugar industry in the South did not return to its pre-Civil War levels until 1893. Economically, we shift down to, let me just pause here for just a second.